Welcome to the first in a series of revision videos based on situation ethics, an ethical theory from the 1960s. This lesson is going to focus on this line in the specification, the middle way between legalism and antinomianism, and it's going to be important that you know what those two terms mean, and then the idea of situation, which of course is integral to situation ethics. Now, I've already said that situation ethics was a theory that's based in the 1960s. And to understand what I mean by that, we need to see the world before the 60s. This slide covers Britain in the 1950s, a society where rationing was still in force, a hangover from the Second World War, where young people forcibly were conscripted into the army as part of their 2-year national service. And it was a deferential, hierarchical society in which Christianity had a very privileged position. This was a world of rules and of duty. The 1960s was a total transformation, a revolution in terms of music, sport, sex, drugs, and the economy. This slide here covers some of the major developments that occurred in a decade which basically saw the invention, emancipation, and empowering of young people. Young people started to look at tradition and the way their elders had run society, and rather than thinking that this was all fantastic and they needed to follow in those footsteps, they said, no, let's change it. We can do better. The world can be better. This is a fundamentally different approach. And Joseph Fletcher, who is going to be the key thinker in situation ethics, thought that this new age called for a new morality, a totally different approach to moral decision making. So to emphasize that point then, before the 60s, legalism was the standard religious approach to ethics. There were clear rules that needed to be followed. And they either came down from Mount Sinai from Moses, or they were enforced in a secular sense by the army and society in general. Strict schooling, deferential approach to management when you joined a firm as an employee, etc. Now, Fletcher had no time for this, and he said that to approach ethical decisions with prefabricated rules and regulations was a recipe for disaster. It was a web that would sooner or later choke its weavers. And he said that people who were legalistic were often good, and he quotes Mark Twain here, in the worst sense of the word. That's not to say that Fletcher thought that no rules whatsoever or a total lack of structure was a preferential route. In fact, antinomianism had been tried by Christians and by secularists before. Antinomianism is another one of those key words the specification requires you to know and understand. And antinomianism simply means the rejection of rules or of the law. Now, there are a couple of famous examples of this. First, in Christianity, Paul, who writes a substantial part of the New Testament, declared that the old rules of Judaism were not necessary or sufficient to lead someone to salvation. In fact, the only thing that you needed was faith in Jesus. So this is the reason why Christians don't follow Jewish purity or dietary laws. Now, the problem with this is some followers got the wrong end of the stick, and they started to believe that as long as they believed in Jesus, they could do whatever they wanted, and so they degenerated morally. And Paul had to reprimand them and say, well, no, grace and faith is the only way that you're actually saved, but morality still exists. Morality is still important. He wasn't rejecting laws full stop. He was just rejecting their role in salvation. A similar rejection of all laws can be found in Plato's Republic, and a character called Thrasymachus, who was a sophist, and that's someone who who argues or teaches for money, and this was seen as totally unacceptable to Plato, who was a philosopher in the purest sense of the word. Now, Thrasymachus says that rules, morality, laws, they don't really exist. They have no basis in fact. Rather, they are just the tools that the rich and the powerful use to oppress the poor and the powerless. So an example of that would be it's obviously in the poor's interest to steal. They have almost nothing to lose and everything to gain by stealing. But the rich will teach them that stealing is morally wrong. Of course, there's no such thing as morality. There might not even be such thing as private property. These are all conceptual inventions, and they use to oppress and to keep people in their place. So Thrasymachus says you should break any rule you can. As long as you can get away with it, you should break the rule. And Socrates, Plato is the author and Socrates is the character in this dialogue, Socrates spends the rest of the Republic arguing why Thrasymachus is wrong. And Fletcher would agree with both St. Paul and with Plato in saying that antinomianism is not a valid way of solving ethical problems. Simply rejecting ethics outright is not acceptable. So if we see antinomianism as one extreme on the spectrum and legalism as another extreme on the spectrum, situation ethics occupies a middle place. It says we should judge each situation on its own merits, so the prefabricated moral solutions of legalism are inappropriate, but that morality still exists and we are still obliged to do good things, and so antinomianism is similarly incorrect. It goes for the middle way. Now, over the next 2 or 3 slides, I've got some quotes directly from Joseph Fletcher. And he says that all the moral laws that have come before, all the rules in Christianity, for example, the 10 Commandments, are not commandments. They aren't things that we need to follow as a legalist would, and they aren't things to throw away as an antinomian would, but they are illuminators. And I really like that term. They are illuminators of a given situation. Circumstances alter cases, and we should be prepared to throw away our principles, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, if they don't work for that situation, but they are illuminators. Situation ethics, he says, is anti-moralistic, it's anti-legalistic, it's sensitive to variety and complexity. And he quotes from St. Paul in the Bible in 2 Corinthians 3:6, where Paul claims that the written code kills but the Spirit gives life, and that the whole of law, of one's obligations to God and our fellow man, can be summarized in the idea that you should love your neighbour as yourself. And this is really the sum and total of situation ethics, that there's just one rule that's binding and unexceptionable, and that is love. And this final point here, that situationism is a method, not a substantive ethic, means that there is not a content, there's not a set body of knowledge like there is in the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church. Instead, it is a way of approaching moral decision making. So to summarise, situation ethics isn't legalistic, it isn't antinomian. It believes instead that there is only one principle that can never be broken, but there is a principle, and that is to do the most loving thing, and that each situation is fundamentally unique, and any successful ethical theory needs to respect that. Hence the name of the theory, situation ethics.